Welcome to the FUBiS online digital lecture series. I'm Ulrich Brückner, and in this lecture I will talk about European integration. But before I introduce myself and the course and the content of this lecture, let's have a look at what FUBiS is. About 21 years ago, I received a message from the Dean of the Freie Universität Berlin, who suggested that the Freie Universität should offer a program between the semesters, and it should be a summer university, and it should focus on Berlin, Germany, and Europe, and attract future students to see what the city and the university has to offer. Ever since, I worked in every single summer, I didn't miss a single one, with FUBiS, and one could think I don't have anything to do in summer, or I'm so neurotic that I cannot leave the city, but both isn't true. I work a lot in different places around the world, and I could also teach in other formats, but FUBiS became one of my favorite courses to teach, and I will tell you in a minute what the reason is for that. FUBiS is a summer program that started very small and then grew over time. If you like to hear more about it, FUBiS produced a film that you can find online on the FUBiS webpage. On the FUBiS website, you find a film that introduces the program, the people who work with FUBiS, and answers all the questions that you might have about studying in Berlin in the summer in this framework. So who is your instructor? I'm a political scientist. I was born and raised in Bavaria, came to Berlin in the 1980s, and decided to specialize in my political science studies on the integration of Europe. I became a Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at the Political Science Department at the Freie Universität, worked there for 10 years, became a visiting professor in Poland and at Stanford in the United States, and joined in 2003 Stanford University in Berlin in the Overseas Center, as well as in California, and ever since being based in Berlin and still stay connected with my alma mater, the Freie Universität. I got several lectureships around the world, teach other summer courses, do vocational training, and also work as a political analyst for English-speaking international media. So what do I like so much about the format of FUBiS courses, and what can you expect if you come to Berlin to learn something about European integration? We work together in 4 weeks, 2 days per week, are dedicated to the content course that I teach. It's a 4 ECTS credit points course, and we work in the morning in class, address questions that introduce the basics of European integration, like history, institutions, various challenges. We talk about how the European Union functions, how it decides, and use different policies to explain what European integration is and does to its member states and as a global organization. By the end of the morning session, before we go for lunch, we will have many more questions than answers, and then it's boring to go back to class and continue with the same format. So we do it slightly different and instead go to the city and try to meet people who are expected to have answers to the questions that we came up with in the morning sessions. And especially the excursions in the afternoon explain what we mean by Berlin as a learning tool. This is a course that you cannot study anywhere else in the world because it uses Berlin as an extended classroom, and you will get access to institutions and meet with experts that even Berliners most likely have never gotten a chance to meet with in person and to ask questions related to what we discussed in the morning. This includes excursions to embassies to change my German bias, given the fact that I'm a German citizen, my point of view on European integration is of course very German, but we also hear the point of view of representatives from other EU member states, from candidate countries, or if it's about external relations, also the perspective of a country that has to do with the European Union as a whole and not only with individual member states. We meet with think tanks, we go to German ministries, and we also include from time to time the point of view of journalists, which does not only broaden the perspective of what do these people think about European integration, but as a side effect, it also gives you a chance to see what political scientists do with their qualification once they graduate, because there's a life after university, and sometimes we simply don't know what kind of job environments exist for someone who has learned and studied as a lifelong experience how the European Union works. Regarding the content, one would think that it's getting boring if I teach a course like this for more than 20 years. While the title might stay the same over the period of 20 years, the content constantly changes because on the one hand, European integration is a dynamic process, and on the other hand, the interests of my students change. And since we cannot address every single policy, we sometimes adjust in a tailor-made reflection phase at the beginning of the course which topics we include and which one from the menu that are offered in session 1 do we skip and replace by something else instead. So given that the agenda of the European Union quickly changes, this year's priority would have been how is the situation after the pandemic? What will be done to address all the unintended side effects of the lockdown? What is the situation for the economic recovery? How much money will be spent? How will it be spent? Who's going to get what? And what are the different pros and cons of managing it in the way it is managed? There will also be some other topics related to the ongoing negotiations about Brexit or climate change, bilateral relations with other countries or blocks, trading blocks in the world. And we get, by looking into different examples, a sense that even if you understand one policy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the full picture of what European integration is about. Why should I study this? In the past, I welcomed more international students, non-Europeans, than citizens of the European Union. For them, it makes perfect sense to understand the supranational framework that directly affects their life. A lot of legislation comes from the European Union, so it matters for them. But why is it interesting for an American or an Australian or an Asian student to come all the way to Berlin to have a closer look at what the European Union is and does? First of all, it helps you to understand politics better. And if you pay attention to how we do things, it might help you to actively engage and to make an active contribution as a citizen who participates in politics to make a change, because in comparison, we learn how we can improve the system that we are part of. We also learn in comparison if we come from different disciplines, which makes the course not only interesting for the students, but it's also my motivation to teach a course like this because of the broad variety of students coming from different parts of the world, studying different disciplines, having a different background. We have older students, younger students, people with work experience, and those who have never left school or university. And they all have their particular take on what they think is happening in this part of the world. So by using the class as a brain pool, we do not only learn from books or what the professor has to say or the experts in the afternoon, but we all together make sense of what we study in a learning environment that is provided by FUBiS. You also expose yourself to a European way of life, so it's not just theory, but you do practically experience how the European Union imposes water regulations if you take a bath in one of the lakes in Berlin, or you see how environmental standards are used, or what the monetary union does if you travel over the weekend to another member state of the Eurozone and you don't need extra money because it's all part of the same European monetary union, and you explore the European way of life in a particular form of pluralism. This is something every student enjoyed the most. So it's not only theoretical thinking, but also applied studies. And we often do a debriefing in a new week, what students have experienced over the weekend as a learning from practical experience and applied European studies. So what is the situation of the European Union after Corona, and which structural problems did already exist before we talk about the internal and external consequences of the pandemic in 2020? The European Union is a complex, and some would also say complicated, institutional architecture that has a lot of benefits if we compare it with the slow and opaque and not very effective form of policymaking in international organizations. But it is also a unique system of policymaking that has its own internal problems. One thing is that if it constantly changes in who's doing what and how many countries are represented in what kind of institutions and what is the legal base, that this appears as a permanent construction site. So it never pretends that everything is already done and set, but it constantly changes how it addresses problems, what the priorities are, also how much money is spent. And that makes it extremely complicated to catch up with how was it last year, what are the priorities today, how have the balances of power in the different policies of the European Union changed, and to what extent does that lead to more democratic accountability, to efficiency, effectiveness, and does it help to identify with this political entity? Because any political system that doesn't find the acceptance of the demos, the citizens, will fall apart, and that is always a risk for something that has a much thinner layer of identification from the citizens, or that citizens identify with such a program. On the other hand, it is dependent on legitimacy in both how citizens can actively join decisions and inform themselves, what we call input legitimacy, to get them on board. But at the same time, it is measured by its ability to deliver. And if it promises to provide peace, freedom, stability, and prosperity, and it doesn't deliver, then it will be criticized. And in the most extreme case, citizens can decide that they don't want to be part anymore. And as in the case of Brexit, a society decides that it's better for them to leave the club with all the consequences, and then the membership comes to an end, which, if it becomes a chain reaction, could be the end of the European Union as we know it. Another problem might occur. Some say it's rhetoric, others say it's the truth, that it has an inbuilt bias towards a liberal way of looking at the world. Liberal in the sense that it focuses on individual freedom rights. It opens borders, and not only physical borders, but what is protected by rules and norms and regulations and traditions, to a certain form of competition, which sometimes exposes cultural developments to competition that are not designed to compete with something. So if you have something like a national tradition, as in Germany, we have a regulation to guarantee a broad spectrum of books that are published in a book market of a country with a lot of readers, then this is a regulation that is not in line with European Union competition policy. And by exposing this bookmark regulation to the liberal idea of free competition, a lot of publishing houses need the protection to calculate on a basis that allows them to offer more titles, to give one example. And this is considered to be a cultural achievement, while if it's not protected, provided by national regulations, it can disappear, and then we have a functioning market economy. But in this market economy, not everything is able to survive under harsh competitive conditions. Another problem that we face, which is not so much a particular European problem, because we see this phenomenon around the world, is the rise of populism. And populists successfully managed to retell the narrative of European integration with a negative bias. So everything the supporters of European integration presented as an achievement, like open borders, the introduction of a common currency, a legal system in which European law is stronger than national law, all this has been redesigned by open borders, increased terrorist threats and insecurity. The state is no longer what it promised to be for its citizens, a provider of security with border protection, because all the internal borders are gone and we only have one external border, which might not be as well protected as the national borders of a country that is located at the heart of this continent. But it also becomes a challenge for citizens when we look at the consequences of the euro crisis after 2008, when the European Monetary Union, similar to other countries that suffered from the sovereign debt crisis, faced harsh adaptation programs like austerity in the periphery of the European Union. And it was associated with European integration because the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Commission went to so-called program countries to tell them what needs to be done to address the structural imbalances that are subject to reform in a member state of the monetary union. So reality is not only how we perceive things and how we measure things, but it's also how we talk about it. There's a very pro-European and optimistic narrative that presents European integration as a beautiful concept of love, peace, and happiness, in which liberal countries get their act together and happily share resources and fix problems that individual countries cannot fix. But there's a counter-narrative that doesn't see the European integration project as the solution, but in essence, part of the problem. And to what extent this is just fake news or a populist narrative that doesn't have empirical evidence is something we will address in our discussions in class, as well as in discussions with representatives from other member states, think tanks, or journalists who professionally report about what is happening in the European Union, what works, and what does not work so well. So what are the internal challenges the integration project faces? I mentioned the rise of populism, but this is not the only problem. There's also a general trend that is described as the erosion of democracy. The EU, committed to Western-type democratic principles, investigates for several years in countries like Poland and Hungary to what extent the ruling party exceeds the limits of what is expected to be a founding principle of a functioning Western-type democracy. The independence of courts, the separation of power, the fair chance of opposition parties to participate in elections. All this is at risk and has been investigated by committees organized by the European Parliament as well as by the European Commission. And in times of Corona, when individual rights have been restricted as an instrument to address the needs in times of a pandemic, there was a risk that centralized powers and the restriction of human rights could be prolonged eternally, or abused to transform the democratic systems into something that does not meet the criteria for membership in the European Union. Another dimension are the flaws of the monetary union. We have seen the project starting in 2001 when coins and banknotes have been introduced as a successful one, but it also came with a number of consequences due to the architecture of the monetary union that divided the gap between center and periphery of the monetary union. And in times of the pandemic, with unpredictable costs to relaunch the recovery of the economies, all the flaws and incomplete structures of the monetary union highlight how important another reform in the central pillar of the monetary union are. In the media last year was first and foremost the exit of a member state that have been a member since 1973 and is referred to as Brexit, combined as Britain leaves or Britain exits the European Union. We are in the middle of negotiations and still don't know whether we will face a hard Brexit or a soft one, referring to a functioning legal relationship that makes it predictable to what extent the division of the different agreements and trade relations and border relations, particularly with Ireland, will be guided into a future of a separated European Union and an independent United Kingdom. What has been a hot potato, as they say in Britain, for many years, particularly since 2015, is the need for a migration policy, and not only a reform of the current asylum regime of the European Union that also shows a lot of flaws and insufficient responses to the pressing needs of people who have the right to apply for asylum in the European Union, and the need to protect the borders of the European Union against whatever threats that could come from outside of the continent. We are also facing the need for reform in the digital systems that made the European Union define a digital agenda that changes the lives of people with the Internet of Things, that has a dimension of another industrial revolution that is as relevant as the introduction of electricity or other technological developments that act as a watershed compared with the situation before that technological innovation. But one of the most pressing needs to address reforms is climate change. That is a global problem, and that is not only something that Europeans are concerned about. This is the pressing challenge for the 21st century if we don't want to transform the planet into something that doesn't allow the human species to survive under conditions that are no longer guaranteed, and it's man-made. What I will pick as a topic, how the European Union responds to, as a collective action, is the post-pandemic economic recovery plan that also shows that European integration is not just another international organization that gives lip service to developments or principles like solidarity, but it acts in dimensions that are unheard of in any other supranational organization or international organization that doesn't show the same commitment that we belong to something bigger, which in our case is called the European Union. But before I go into the details of what the European Union is planning to do, let's have a look at the external side of challenges. The pandemic is not only something that hits home and countries in a very asymmetric way. We have countries like Italy, the United Kingdom, France, or Spain that suffer from a high number of deaths caused by the pandemic. We also see countries that managed to deal with the pandemic in a better way in terms of numbers. But it also has, aside from the health dimension, economic and social consequences that do not only exist in the European Union, but it is truly a global pandemic, and therefore the economic conditions that matter for an export-oriented economic model like the European Union one will be massively affected by the state of the global economy in the coming years. In this ongoing economic struggle, we will see a more controversial debate about what is the global order and how do we negotiate the terms, how to address the challenges of the 21st century. The idea of the European Union in its continental integration project was based on the idea that the rule of law, self-binding commitments for countries that participate in this, is a model that can also be exported to the global level, which means that the United Nations and its organizations represent a similar concept of self-binding commitments based on the rule of law. An alternative model is a multipolar world in which power players like the United States or China or India or Russia believe that at the end of the day, it's a matter of how powerful you are. That depends, that relates to ad hoc decisions in order to fight for its particular interests. Such a system is in contrast to a predictable, rule-based organization like the European Union. And although the EU's model is lobbying for a multilateral architecture, there are signs that we will see a much stronger transformation towards a power play of different poles and individual power players that either withdraw from international commitments or try to get free from self-binding international treaties. This refers also to a changing role of the United States that focuses more on what is important for the United States and not providing something like a common good as a hegemon, but we also see a rising China that offers an alternative political and economic model that directly affects the rest of the world. The European Union, located where it is also confronted by global challenges that have to do with the sanction towards Russia and Iran. We see a rise of authoritarian systems, so the optimistic idea of what we experience in Europe with Western-type democracies and a commitment to the rule of law and human rights will rise, and we see the successful spread of liberal systems and Western-type democratic regimes in its variation around the world. Instead, one can observe a rise of authoritarian systems that question the legitimacy of the generalist idea of the rule of law. This also comes with security threats, both as a military option as well as terrorism. So what is the European Union doing to address all this? As one example, we see at the moment different proposals coming from member states or groups of member states, as well as from the European Commission, which is the administration of the European Union. And the latest proposal that will be discussed in the coming months during the so-called EU presidency, which is held by Germany, which would have made it even more interesting to come to FUBiS and to study and see what German institutions and other member states expect from an EU presidency and where can one study this better than in the German capital, is presented by the European Commission in what can be highlighted as solidarity in action. There's a first package, what they call SURE and the European Stability Mechanism pandemic package of more than $500 billion to help workers and businesses with immediate financial aid. There's another 750 billion temporary reinforcement package that is labeled Next Generation EU, a proposal by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And there is the 7 years multi-annual financial framework that sums up to more than 1 trillion that EU member states are expected to spend through the budget of the European Union in the coming 7 years. This is a lot of money in times when a lot of money is needed to address the challenges that I just listed, given the limited time. And it, of course, highlights that there are conflicting interests about how to spend it. Should it be spent with grants or loans? And will it come with conditionality? Or can each and every member state basically decide what is a priority and how should money be spent because of the pressing needs in their economies and social systems? This all will fuel a discussion about what will be the future polity of the European Union, how will it change the nature of the European Union. And in essence, we can identify 3 different general paths. One will be we integrate more, and the European Union could become something like the United States of Europe or the Federal Republic of Europe, or whatever name you prefer to highlight the different quality compared to its current state of integration. A second one would be to differentiate more and to address the fact that there are not only competing interests and ideas about what is the right framework for pooling resources and addressing problems beyond the nation state, but there are also requests for renationalizing already Europeanized policies. And all of these different ideas have their pros and cons. What we will do in class is to identify the pros and cons and discuss the different rationales why politicians favor the one or the other, because in academia we don't prefer one solution as the superior one because everything comes with costs and benefits. As one general illustration of what I mean by that, more Europe will certainly restrict the autonomy of each and every member state. What we will get instead is a one-size-fits-all solution that is more effective in what it could do, but it will also ignore the cultural differences as well as to what extent countries are differently affected and therefore might need a more differentiated solution. If we would then highlight more differentiation, like a multi-speed concentric circle type of Europe, it will increase the complexity. It will be harder for citizens to identify with something that is more like overlapping club memberships. And it will strengthen those member states that can move on quicker because they have the resources and the willingness and also the administrative capacity to integrate further, which makes the others that are not yet ready condition takers without having a say, and then they wait outside of the door to hear what the core group members decide, and that will directly affect them. So independence has its pros and cons, and it will be difficult to see how that affects the identification of each and every citizen with what comes as multi-speed Europe. Finally, less Europe will certainly strengthen the lower levels, and you can offer tailor-made agreements, but you also get less done, which will increase the frustration with Europe that does not punch above its weight, but rather the opposite. And that will start a discussion about to what extent do we actually need to pay or pool resources if the club doesn't provide what it promises to provide. So to draw a conclusion from this general overview, we are in a situation that could be labeled never miss a good crisis, because if everything is perfectly stable, or maybe not perfectly, but stable in a certain equilibrium that no one wants to change because it would come with risk and uncertainties, we miss a window of opportunity that allows to address urgently needed reforms. So there is something positive about crisis times, and that is why I called it never miss a good crisis. It could also lead to the end of the European Union as we know it, which is probably not a bad thing because it has always changed. The European community of the 1950s has not much to do with how the European Union currently appears. It will again highlight the fact that European integration is a dynamic process. So even if by the end of the course you think you know what European integration is, I assure you that next year the story will be told differently, and it makes sense to catch up and to follow the latest developments in the news that you will be able to understand better than without taking a course at FUBiS in Berlin. If this is a good development or a bad one, again, depends on the yardsticks that we use to measure developments. And one can generalize that measurements to explore European integration developments could be, on a very abstract level, summarized as effectiveness. Does it do what it promised? Efficiency. Does it use resources wisely, or is it wasting time, money, capacities of the member states? And last but not least, because it is committed to Western-type democracy and its standards, is it accountable? Does it meet its own standards? Or to use an anecdote, if the European Union would apply for membership, would it be rejected because of its democratic deficit? All these discussions are important, and we will address them in our excursions the moment we can go back to normal and discuss the theoretical reflections in the morning and take our questions to the city to hear what experts have to say, who by job description are expected to have an answer to our question. So, as a conclusion, we will learn from competing narratives and see that everything has a variation of how the story can be told. This is in essence what pluralism is about, and there's no such thing like I will preach why European integration is a great development and achievement, and there is no reason to criticize this. We only become better by using our critical minds and question what is presented by politicians as the truth or a normative position, why something is better than before. We in academia bite the hand that feeds us and criticize why it's not even better than what we managed to achieve. But we try to find a fair balance between the different narratives and test them no matter in what direction they are biased. On this happy note, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next possible normal framework of FUBiS to introduce European integration to you in person. Thank you very much.